been baptized. He's called his disciples. And the first thing that happens is that he goes to a wedding in Cana of Galilee. Cana is a little town probably about 10 miles away from Nazareth. And this wedding is probably a big deal. You can imagine village life in the first century. What are the big social events of the year? Well, they might have something when someone's born, or they might have a funeral when someone dies. But the really joyful ones are the ones when there's a wedding. And these weddings would go on for 7 days. And everybody in the extended families would all be invited and descend on this town. And it seems that that's what happened with Jesus and his disciples. Maybe this is a distant cousin of somebody. And isn't it remarkable that John, in the first thing that Jesus does, is he goes to a party. And he doesn't just go to a party, he becomes the life of the party. And there's something joyful about this that John wants you to celebrate right from the beginning. And that is that Jesus is a party goer. And he comes to our parties, and he laughs along with us, and he has a good time and enjoys the fellowship of one another. Well then, of course, they run out of wine. This is a big problem. Because after all these relatives from all over the other villages have come to town. They're here for a week, and it's only the third day of the wedding celebration, and they've run out of wine. And this would be a big problem for a bride and a groom, and it would live on in history. And so you remember that wedding that was such a flop? And their reputations are at stake in the community itself. And Mary knows this, and she says, they've run out of wine. And Jesus responds, interestingly, well, what has that got to do with you and me? And she says, knowing that he's going to do something, says to the servants, do whatever he tells you to do. And he, of course, tells them to fill those big jars full of water that happen to be standing there, and then take some of that to the leader of the feast and have them taste it. And of course, they do that, and it has become wine, and not only wine, but very good wine, the best wine of the party. Now, we always have to remember that we're talking about a lot of wine. These are big jars, roughly 150 gallons worth. That computes into, I'm told, about 1,000 bottles of wine. That's a lot of wine, even for a 7-day wedding. 150 gallons, and it's not, those gallon bottles of Gallows. It's not Gallows, we know, because this is the best wine of the feast. So it's some vintage that's better than that. It's a ridiculous miracle. It just doesn't make any sense at all. It's just so overflowing with ridiculousness. You're supposed to kind of laugh at the amount of wine that he's done and that he would do it so casually, and that the party would then go on. John, I think, starts this gospel of his with this story for a couple of reasons. Maybe one of them is that he wants you to know Jesus was a fun guy and went to parties. But really, the message, obviously, is one of abundance. It is one of how this miracle is so overwhelming. It is not just a little blessing that has been bestowed on this wedding. It is a ridiculously big blessing that has been given to this wedding. And that's John's point, right from the beginning in the gospel, is that the blessing that Jesus brings into the world is beyond measure. It's ridiculous that it isn't comparable to any other blessing in the world at all. That Jesus' coming into the world is beyond measure in terms of being God's blessing on the world. And what does that mean for us when we hear this story and we begin to move into John's Gospel? Well, it, at the very least, encourages us to see the world that way. To see that Jesus coming into the world is the fount of enormous blessing in our own lives. It's an encouragement for us to look at our own lives and its blessedness and all the goodness that comes to us despite ourselves, all the undeserved goodness that we have in our lives. In the chapter just before this, John says that the Word becomes flesh and dwells among us, and from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace, upon grace, upon grace. It's all about grace for John, and that Jesus is the source of all that grace, and we are the recipients of that grace. So at the very least, when we hear this story, we should look at our lives in that way and see that the heart of our lives is that we are the recipients of that great blessing and grace in all sorts of ways. We don't live that way, usually. We usually are aware of it once in a while, but usually we live more by our desires, our appetites, our fears, our angers. We don't live by blessing. And that's what this story encourages us to do, to look at the blessing that Jesus brings into our own lives. Now you might say, well, that's true. We are in our individual lives very blessed. But some people aren't. And what sense do you make of that? What do you say about the child who dies of malnutrition or abuse? What do you say about those who have chronic illnesses that keep them crippled from a full life? Why isn't God's blessing poured on them as well? Well, I don't know. But I do know in the story, it's Mary who says to Jesus, look. And Jesus doesn't reply. There's a pause. Until he does act. And you remember the story about the Samaritan woman at the well, and she wants her daughter to be healed, and Jesus says, I've come to save the people of Israel and to be their Messiah and to feed them. And she says, yes, but even the dogs can eat the food that falls from the table. She opens his eyes to the fullness of his calling as the Messiah. And after that, he understands that he is the Messiah for the world, Jew and Gentile alike, not just for the Jewish people. And that's what Mary does in this story. She opens his eyes. She says, hey, pay attention. You can do something about this. So maybe one of the things that we're supposed to take from this story as well is that that's our role. That's what prayer is about. You ask why? Why do we pray for people? Well, maybe that's all we're doing. Maybe we're just saying, hey, God, pay attention. That person, pay attention. And maybe that's the way God responds. Because God wasn't paying attention in that case. The other thing about blessing in the world and the fact that some people are so suffering is that maybe what this story tells us now that we know so firmly that we are the recipients of this blessing of God is that now we are the blessing. We are the blessing to be brought to the rest of the world. We are God's blessing because we are in Christ. And just like Mary says to Jesus, hey, look over there. Maybe that's what we need to say to one another as well. Hey, you're the blessing. You're God's blessing in the world. You are the one who will bring bounty and joy and healing to this world. And that's the fullness of our calling, is to be the blessing of God in this world. Amen.
Amen.